What if everything you were told about this family was only part of the truth, and the real story was hiding in plain sight for years? In this video, we are breaking down the moments that quietly changed everything, the decisions that reshaped relationships, and the realization that once it arrives, cannot be ignored. Stay with me, because what starts as a discussion about trust slowly reveals why nothing was ever going to end the way it began. There was a moment early on when everything still looked calm on the surface, when smiles were practiced and conversations sounded cooperative. But underneath that calm, something was already shifting, because trust, once weakened, never fully recovers. And what viewers are watching now is not a sudden collapse, but the slow result of years of unresolved tension, quiet compromises, and choices that were explained away at the time as necessary or temporary. And this story matters because it shows how small decisions, repeated over and over, can reshape an entire family dynamic without anyone noticing until it is too late. And as the layers are pulled back, what becomes clear is that the conflict was never just about property or finances or disagreements, but about who was allowed to speak, who was expected to stay silent, and who benefited from that silence. And that imbalance created a dynamic where loyalty was rewarded and questions were treated as betrayal. And when people are placed in that position long enough, they begin to doubt their own instincts, even when those instincts are telling them something is wrong. And that is where the real tension begins. Because once doubt turns into clarity, there is no way to reverse it. And clarity changes how every past interaction is remembered, every conversation replayed, every promise reconsidered. And suddenly, moments that once seemed harmless take on new meaning. And the audience feels that shift because it mirrors something deeply human, the realization that what you accepted for years no longer aligns with what you know to be true. And this realization does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, and then it grows. And the more it grows, the harder it becomes to ignore, and the harder it becomes to maintain appearances. And that is why this phase feels so charged, because the emotional investment is no longer about preserving the family image, but about reclaiming personal truth. And once that priority changes, the entire narrative follows, and the tension builds, not from confrontation, but from anticipation, because viewers sense that something long buried is finally being acknowledged, and each statement feels like it is circling a truth that has been avoided for far too long. And that circling keeps people watching, because every time the story seems like it might settle, it instead opens another layer, another memory, another moment that suddenly feels unfinished and unresolved. And this creates a loop where the past and present collide and demand attention at the same time. And the reason this loop is so effective is because it reflects the experience of those involved, who are also revisiting their own histories through a new lens and questioning why certain things were accepted, why certain patterns were normalized, and why speaking up always seemed to come at such a high cost. And that questioning is uncomfortable, but it is also necessary, because without it, there is no growth, only repetition. And repetition is what brought everything to this point in the first place. And as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the real fracture did not happen in one argument or one decision, but in the accumulation of moments where fairness felt optional and transparency felt selective. And when people sense that they are being asked to give more than they receive, resentment does not appear overnight. It builds quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. And that is where this narrative now lives, in that space between realization and response. And the audience is drawn in because they are waiting to see how that realization will finally be expressed, whether it will be met with understanding or deflection, whether accountability will appear, or whether the same patterns will repeat yet again. And that uncertainty fuels the suspense, because no one truly knows how far the truth will be allowed to go once it has been invited into the conversation. And that is the real suspense, not what will happen, but when the truth will be finally spoken. Invitation has already been extended simply by acknowledging that things are not as they were presented, and once that door opens, it rarely closes again, and the weight of that openness hangs over every interaction, every pause, every carefully chosen word. And viewers feel it because authenticity has a gravity that performance cannot match. And as the story continues, the focus shifts away from who is right and who is wrong and moves instead toward who was heard and who was not. Because being unheard for years changes a person. It teaches them to internalize conflict, to minimize their own needs, and to prioritize harmony over honesty, until eventually harmony becomes hollow and honesty becomes unavoidable. And that transition is what makes this chapter so compelling, because it is not fueled by anger, but by resolve. And resolve is steady. It does not rush, and it does not need validation. And that steadiness is unsettling to those who benefited from the old order, because it cannot be easily dismissed or redirected. And that is why the tension feels constant rather than explosive, because it is grounded in certainty rather than reaction. And certainty does not fade with time, it only strengthens. And as viewers watch, they are not just witnessing a family story, they are witnessing a universal process of awakening and boundary setting that resonates far beyond this specific situation. And that resonance keeps people engaged because they recognize pieces of their own experiences in the patterns unfolding on screen. And that recognition creates investment, and that investment keeps attention locked, even when the story slows down, because every quiet moment feels like it is carrying something important. And that importance is not about shock value, but about validation and the acknowledgement that what was once dismissed as overthinking or sensitivity was actually perception, and perception, once trusted, changes everything. And as this part of the story continues, it becomes increasingly clear that the past cannot be rewritten, but it can be re-examined. And re-examination is powerful because it strips away excuses and focuses instead on impact. And impact is what lingers long after intentions are forgotten. And when impact is finally named, it forces a reckoning, not just for those directly involved, but for anyone watching who has ever been told to be patient, to be understanding, to accept less in the name of peace. And that is why this narrative holds attention, because it quietly asks a question that many people avoid. What happens when patience runs out and peace no longer feels peaceful? And that question does not need to be answered immediately, because its presence alone is enough to shift the entire direction of the story and keep viewers watching until the very last moment, waiting to see whether the truth that has finally surfaced will be met with accountability, or whether it will simply stand on its own as a statement that no longer requires permission to exist. As this story moves forward, the tension does not fade, it deepens, because once awareness takes hold, it begins to touch everything. And that is when people realize that the issue was never a single disagreement or a single moment, but a structure that rewarded silence and discouraged honesty. And when that structure is questioned, it feels threatening to those who relied on it and liberating to those who felt trapped by it. And that contrast is where the emotional weight now lives, because everyone involved is responding not just to the present conversation, but to years of unspoken thoughts and unresolved feelings. And that accumulation makes every reaction feel heavier, more deliberate, and more revealing. And the audience senses that because nothing feels casual anymore. Every word sounds measured, every pause feels intentional, and every explanation carries the pressure of being examined rather than accepted. And that examination is long overdue, because for years, the narrative moved forward without stopping to ask who was carrying the cost of keeping everything together and who was benefiting from that effort. And once that question is asked, it cannot be unanswered, because it reframes the entire history and invites a different kind of accountability. One that is not about blame, but about recognition. And recognition is powerful because it validates experiences that were previously minimized. And that validation changes how people see themselves and their role in the story. And once people stop internalizing fault, they begin to speak differently, with more confidence and less hesitation. And that shift alters the dynamic completely because it removes the leverage that came from guilt and obligation and replaces it with boundaries and clarity. And boundaries are often misunderstood as distance, but in reality, they are a form of honesty. And honesty is what has been missing for a long time. And that absence created a vacuum where assumptions grew unchecked and misunderstandings hardened into resentment. And now that vacuum is being filled, not with accusations, but with perspective. And perspective allows people to connect the dots in ways they could not before. And those connections reveal patterns that once felt isolated, but now appear consistent and intentional. And that realization is uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that everything happened by chance or misunderstanding, and instead suggests that some outcomes were predictable given the choices that were made. And when predictability enters the conversation, it shifts responsibility away from fate and toward agency. And agency is difficult to confront because it implies that things could have been different, and that possibility can bring grief as much as relief because it forces people to mourn what might have been had different paths been chosen. And that mourning is subtle but present in the tone and pacing of the story because beneath the analysis, there is loss of trust, loss of partnership, loss of the version of the family that was once believed to exist. And acknowledging that loss is not easy because it requires letting go of illusions that once provided comfort and stability. And yet that letting go is necessary for growth. And the audience recognizes this process because it mirrors emotional journeys many have taken themselves. And that recognition creates empathy and keeps viewers engaged, not out of curiosity alone, but out of connection. And as the narrative continues, the focus remains on the present, not as a place of resolution, but as a moment of reckoning, where choices are no longer deferred and feelings are no longer softened for the sake of appearance. And that firmness does not come from anger, but from fatigue, the fatigue of explaining, the fatigue of waiting. Fatigue of hoping that things will change without direct acknowledgement, and when fatigue reaches that level, it transforms into resolve. And resolve is quiet but immovable. And that immovability changes how conversations unfold because it removes the urgency to persuade and replaces it with a simple statement of truth. And that simplicity is disarming because it leaves little room for deflection or reinterpretation. And that is why the tension remains steady rather than explosive, because there is nothing left to negotiate, only to accept or reject. And that binary choice creates suspense because viewers are waiting to see how others will respond, whether they will meet clarity with honesty or retreat into familiar defenses. And that uncertainty keeps attention focused because each response carries the potential to either move the story forward or confirm that certain patterns will never change. And that confirmation can be just as revealing as transformation because it provides closure of a different kind. The closure of knowing that effort was made and that the outcome is no longer dependent on patience or compromise. And that kind of closure is empowering because it frees people from the endless cycle of expectation and disappointment and allows them to redirect their energy toward rebuilding on their own terms. And that rebuilding is hinted at throughout the narrative, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a gradual shift in tone and priority, where self-respect takes precedence over reconciliation at any cost. And that shift resonates deeply because it reflects a universal truth that relationships cannot survive on sacrifice alone without mutual care and consideration. And when that balance is missing, no amount of loyalty can compensate. And as this part of the story unfolds, the audience remains engaged because they are not just watching events, they are witnessing a process of self-reclamation that unfolds step by step without rushing toward a tidy conclusion. And that openness invites viewers to stay present because the outcome is not predetermined, and the value lies not in who wins, but in who finally feels seen. And that sense of being seen is what transforms this from a simple recounting of events into a moment of meaning. And that meaning lingers because it speaks to the importance of honesty, accountability, and the courage to step out of roles that no longer fit. And as long as that courage remains visible, the story will continue to hold attention because it reflects something real, something earned, and something that cannot be undone once it has begun. At the end of the day, this story is not about land, money, or disagreements. It is about what happens when truth finally replaces silence and clarity takes the place of compromise. Once that shift happens, there is no going back, only forward. And whether accountability follows or not, one thing is certain: the truth has been spoken, and that changes everything.